Hello and welcome to the Monster in the Cupboard, the B-side. And this B-side, I'm taking one element of my conversation with Meg and looking at how that might show up or be explored in therapy. And the bit from the A-side I'm taking this episode is where we talk about fear being a red flag, which should be heeded, or whether it's some other kind of displaced anxiety which should be overridden. Therapy can help decipher the difference. In therapy, we look at the fear really closely, so we won't try to dismiss it as if it's got nothing to tell us. As a therapist, I would be asking, especially of more psychological, kind of egoic fears, can we expand the tolerance that you have for that fear? Can you sit with your fear a bit more? Can you pull it close rather than just push it away? Because the fear will have data for us, it'll have information for us. And this is one of the main things that we do in therapy, and that's increase our tolerance for emotional struggle. Generally across the board, but today we're talking specifically about fear. And I want to do things a bit differently this time with this episode, so I'm going to invite you to get a pen and paper. If you haven't got a pen and paper or can't find one, then create 4 headings on a notes page on your phone, or if you are driving and you can't do either of those things, then just kind of picture the following graph. In fact, you could actually have a look at the graph on my website. So if you go to www.nadinepittam.com. That's my counselling website. And if you click on the link on the right-hand side at the top on the navigation bar for the podcast, This Won't Fix You, then you'll see the image on that page of my website. I just want to say a few things about the graph here. I want you to picture the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis, going from left to right, left being the past, right being the future. And the y-axis, which is the vertical axis, at the top is the egoic self and at the bottom is the physical self. And this graph isn't something that I have explicitly used with people. In fact, it's something that I only explicitly designed for the purposes of this podcast to kind of see if we could section certain anxieties into different kind of domains to make them more accessible and more easy to interpret and analyse for the benefit of the podcast. So it's not necessarily something I would use with people in the therapy room, but it does give me a greater understanding of the nature of people's anxieties. And by egoic self, I mean, I suppose, the psychological self, the kind of anything that does not encompass a physical fear, really. So anything where we might think we've offended somebody, or we might offend somebody, or we might become humiliated or dissolve or not be able to handle ourselves or feel shame or any of those kinds of things. Sort of more emotional, but I'm going to call it the egoic self for the basis of this episode. So if you've got a pen and paper or your notes on your phone, then they are the 4 quadrants, and we're going to call them A, B, C, D. So top left A, top right B, bottom left C, and bottom right D. And so, presuming you've got that nailed, let me ask you then, without picking something traumatic, find something that generates just a little bit of anxiety. And then I want you to plot it on the graph of the website. And in order to help you do that, let me just fling a few questions at you so that you can see if you can plot it on the graph. So does this affect your identity, your ego? Does this thing that you're thinking of, this anxiety that you're thinking of, does it threaten the version of yourself that you want to project into the world? Is it challenging your belief about the world or yourself in it, about how you are being perceived or how you're going to be perceived? Does it feel like your physical body is at risk, that you might get injured, physically injured? Or is it more that there's a discrepancy between the person that you are and the person that you want to be? Maybe you feel you're falling short of some standard that you've set yourself. Does the fear involve thoughts about what other people are thinking about you? So are you trying to mind read other people's thoughts so that you can manage that and therefore discharge the feelings that accompany it? Because basically anxiety is discomfort where 2 parts of ourselves are in conflict. So what is it that you think will discharge that feeling? And if you're rattling this around in your head, then you perhaps haven't resolved that conflict. Does this experience that you're thinking of relate to something that you've said or done in the past, or something that you're planning to do, or something that you might encounter in the future, or something you might need to say to somebody, or fear that you might have to hear from somebody? And do you want this fear to impact your life? As in, are you happy that your life would be shrunk as a result of heeding this fear? So I'm not sure that makes sense. Let me give you an example. So maybe you feel frightened of going into public spaces that are particularly crowded. If that's a fear that you have, then are you happy to adhere to that fear and shrink your life and not go out to crowded spaces? That might be a cost that you're willing to pay for your perceived safety. That's a question to ask yourself. Anyway, all of those things, if you answer all those questions, it might help you plot your anxiety thought that I've just prompted you to think about. It might help you to plot that on the graph. So which kind of quadrant would you put it in? Is it something that you're fearing about the future and a conversation or something egoic in the future, or is it something physical that happened to you in the past that you still can't process, or where does it sit on the quadrant? Okay, so let's kind of look to where most anxiety sits first, which is the top right-hand quadrant, the top right-hand window of the window pane. And that will be things that you're worried about in the future that relate to your egoic self. So they don't threaten your physical self. I mean, they might do kind of indirectly, I suppose. If, you're frightened about something so much that you don't sleep, then that could potentially impact your physical self. But I'm talking kind of a little bit more bluntly, a little bit more obviously than that. What I'm going to ask you to do here is to try and sort of tease out some of the more specific things that you could find from this section. Because anything that we're worried about happening in the future has a risk of shrinking our life. And basically, I want you to be working out what's helpful for us to work out is if we heed that warning that our anxiety is throwing up, then we run the risk of shrinking our life. And shrinking our life is the cost that we pay for safety. And so maybe sometimes that's okay. It's okay to shrink our lives and not, for example, walk through that field of cows and maybe do something different if we think those cows are going to trample us. That might be an okay cost to have to pay for our safety. I'm going to a water park soon, and I am not going. There's one particular bit of the water park I am not going to take myself on because I fear that I'm going to throw my knee out and I'll never be able to walk again. That feels like an okay part of the park to avoid. That's not shrinking my life more than I'm prepared. I'm still going to the water park. I'm still going to have fun with my friends, but I'm not going to go on that part of the water park. Okay, so some questions then that I want you to think about that will help you kind of work out whether you're trying to control something or avoid something, or whether just to sort of tease out how it sits in that quadrant and how you might be able to assess to what extent this is going to shrink your life. And so I want you to take the fear to its final conclusion, or perhaps focus on the part that is most terrifying, and think about whether you want to be restricted in your life by that kind of reticence. So when we're thinking about the future egoic fears that we might have, so things that we're frightened about in the future that maybe risk our ego, and you have to take the fear to its final conclusion. Really think about kind of what the fear is that you're worried about here. So, and there's two examples I'm going to use later. One is a fear about an exam that you have to sit, or a test or something like that, like a driving test or an exam to progress to the next level at work, or maybe your GCSEs or A-levels, kind of academic examinations. And a conversation that you have to have, a difficult conversation with a friend or a relative. They're the two examples I'm going to give. So if you take that fear to its final conclusion, where does it take you? So if we take the example of the exam, and you take that to its final conclusion, what is it that you're afraid of? Are you afraid that you're going to fail the exam? Are you afraid that you're going to get a bad grade? And what then? What does it mean if you get a bad grade? Will somebody be disappointed? Or will it mean that your family is disappointed? Will it mean that somebody in your family will think you're not clever? Will it mean that you think you're not clever? Or will it confirm the one thing that you're terrified that your team will find out about you? And again, what does that mean for your, in inverted commas, self? Will it mean that you can no longer see yourself as a successful person? And again, what does that mean? There can be all sorts of belief systems at play when we consider how we feel in relation to success or failure at tests and exams. And again, if I can ask you to think about, would you want to be restricted in your life by that kind of reticence? So if you're frightened of the exam so much, are you prepared to not sit it? Is that a safety that you want to seek at the cost of sitting the exam? Does it feel safe enough to do the exam at all? And what would happen if that thing that you feared the most did happen? Because actually it is only your egoic self that is going to suffer. So if you do fail or you get a bad grade, whatever that means for you, what is the thing that's going to happen? It will generally be something to do with your belief system about yourself, or about the version of you that you want projecting into the world, that will be at risk in some way. Sometimes we can think about how long we've been frightened about that kind of thing too. Maybe we've always struggled with exams because of one reason or another, some sort of experience we had when we were younger, or because our family view exams as really important. My family never really rated them, so they've never been anything I've been particularly frightened of, because my academic success was never something that my family rated. But I've certainly sat in the counselling room with many people who did so well at school, so well at college, and then when they get to university, they're terrified of starting even the next academic thing, because they're so frightened of failing, because they've never failed, they've always succeeded. And that is a really, really common presenting factor. And that always takes us somewhere interesting in the therapy room, and how specific the fear is. You know, if you can take it to its end, what is the part of you that dies? What is the part of you that fails? What's the part of you that you can no longer sustain or convince people of? And that will, I suppose, tell you that this is definitely a future egoic anxiety fear. Another example I can give is if you're frightened of having a difficult conversation with somebody, maybe a relative, a friend, or a partner, and you've got all sorts of questions to ask, like, does it mean then that this person has a toxic impact on my life? So as in, should I basically heed this warning that my anxiety is throwing up? And if it means that this person has a toxic impact on my life and they have continually been a difficult person to navigate conflict with, then do I want them in my life? Again, am I prepared to shrink my life by cutting this person or not having this conversation? Am I prepared to shrink my life in order to seek safety? Or maybe it's something that you want to kind of identify what the anxiety is, because you don't want to heed it. So does it mean that you're frightened that you're going to be made fun of or humiliated or dismissed by this person? Or maybe it means that you're rubbish at arguing because you always lose, and that might be a narrative that you have in your head. Does it mean that you'll reveal too much of your vulnerability and feel exposed? Maybe you'll give the impression that you care more than they do. These are all egoic threats. And so again, you have to make a decision. Is this something I feel often with this person? Or is it something that is kind of brand new in this situation, and I'm actually prepared to try and face this and endure the difficult conversation that I have to have? And your decision to avoid the conversation or to kick the can down the road with it says something about where you place value in your life. So perhaps there's something about this relationship that needs to change for you to be happy in it, but maybe you are more prepared to endure that difficulty than you are to risk losing it completely if you have the conversation. So there's all those kinds of risks and threats that you need to weigh up. And finally, you need to ask yourself, is this the person that I want to be? If I choose to not have this difficult conversation, or if I choose to not sit that exam or do that test, like for instance my driving test, that will shrink my life, and is that okay? Is it okay that I don't pass my driving test? Is it okay that I lose this friendship because it no longer works for me? If that shrinkage is something that you're prepared to accept, then you heed the anxiety. If it's not, then seek a therapist, and they will help you, they will support you through the changes that you need to make. So now let's have a quick look at the first box, which is box A, the top left-hand corner, and this is the past egoic self. So here's where another chunk of anxiety often shows up, because people look back at relationships or exchanges or moments from the past and feel a kind of dread about how they behaved or what they said. I mean, you might have been drunk, you might have, is it beer fear? I've heard people talk about beer fear. And there was a situation I had a few years ago with somebody, and I recall talking with him, and he was quite anxious about a situation where he had, quite unusually for him, because he's such a people pleaser, stood up for himself. And he was trying to figure out why he was so anxious, because he'd stood up for himself, and he was really, really pleased with the fact that he'd stood up for himself. But the thing is, if you're replaying something in your head over and over again, then it might, and I stress might, it might only might, but it might have something to teach you. You might not like what it has to teach you, but chances are if you're playing it over in your mind, there might be something that does sit in conflict with who you are, potentially. So it's worth investigation. So this guy, he couldn't stop playing the part in his head where he'd finally told this other person, a colleague, exactly how he'd felt. And he was so glad that he'd done that. And so he couldn't understand why he was anxious, why he kept replaying it in his head. His other colleagues didn't like this guy either, so there was no risk to his sort of standing with his colleagues for the fact that he'd stood up to this guy. And after exploring this discomfort for an hour with me, he realised that the part that was rearing its head was one particular moment where he'd been cruel. So it wasn't the part where he'd stood up for himself that was whizzing in his head. It was the part where he had taken the altercation too far, and he knew it. But it's a really difficult thing to face if we look back at something and go, oh my God, did I do that wrong? It's a really difficult thing to kind of admit, because our brains spend so much of the time trying to convince us that we've done the right thing, and that sends us into conflict, because actually there is a part of us that knows that we've stepped out of line or we've done something that conflicts with our moral perspectives. So basically he realised that standing up for myself is good, resorting to pejorative attack transgresses my own moral code of conduct and it brings me discomfort. That's kind of what he discovered. And facing these kinds of realisations, like I say, is not easy. We have to accept that we didn't behave as we would have liked. And without the kind of exploration that comes from that sort of scrutiny, without a therapeutic exploration maybe, this guy would have assumed that he just shouldn't ever stand up for himself again. And that would have done him a disservice, because actually what he realised was that there was a lot to learn. And I suppose that's the bit I want to draw out about the two sides of the graph that are on the left, the two left-hand sides that relate to the past rather than the future. So this is box A and box C, is that we often have something to learn. So the things that exist in the past, if they're staying in our heads or in our bodies, if it's a physical quadrant, then we have something to learn from them. And that's a really important thing to take away. Let's move to the fourth quadrant now, which is the bottom right, which looks to the future. So things that are anxiety-provoking about the future, but that are about our physicality, our physical self, our bodies, arguably our lives, I suppose. And we might feel frightened of something that poses a real threat to our physical health or well-being. And those things may be red flags which we should heed. But again, not always. In our modern Western world, most threats to our physical selves occur in the moment. They aren't often situations that we plan to put ourselves into in the future, in the same way that we might plan to put ourselves into situations which threaten our egoic or psychological sense of safety. So like the example I gave about the water park, that is a future physical anxiety. I'm going to go and put myself in a physically demanding situation that might result in injury in some way. So how can I mitigate that risk of injury? What I've asked at the beginning, what I presented at the beginning, was expanding your tolerance for fear. And so if expanding your tolerance for fear in this situation could increase harm done to you, then again it might be a red flag worth heeding. So again, take the aquapark example. If I expand my tolerance for that fear, then I might go, I'm going to do it anyway, and I might put myself on that particular activity. And that actually genuinely might increase the risk of harm done to me. And so that red flag then that I haven't heeded perhaps would have been one that I could have and maybe should have heeded, as I have many times in the past utterly disregarded them when it comes to my physical health, thinking, it'll be all right. I need to find ways to heed it. I think Meg and I talked about the example on the A side. We talked about not wanting to jump off that rock into the water because I'm frightened that I'm going to hit something. And so maybe I could break down that future fear into little steps, like the cow example I gave earlier too. If I'm frightened that if I walk through that field of cows I might get trampled on, is it possible to do a quick risk assessment of the physical dangers? And are we then able to take steps to make those physical dangers less risky? Like, for instance, with the field of cows, I can see the field is full of cows. Am I able to wait for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour for them to move to another part of the field? Or can I find a way to navigate the field in a way which does not put me at risk of the cows, like not putting myself between the cow and the calf? Or are there all sorts of different things that I can do? Can I break down this thing that I'm going to do that will not necessarily shrink my life? Because remember, we're in the future zone, so anything that we heed in the future, any anxieties about the future that we heed, will likely shrink our life in some way. Sometimes that's okay, sometimes that's a good thing. And if we can't take steps to make our fear smaller, or if we've already done that and we're still feeling frightened, then we find ourselves facing the option of shrinking our life into whatever way honouring the fear would lead to, or choosing to do the right thing and endure whatever risks that we fear. There's no right or wrong answer. There's definitely no right or wrong. The only way to resolve it is to bring it towards ourselves and look at it. And of course, the final quadrant now is quadrant C, which is the bottom left, which is past things that impacted us physically. And this often is where we're in the kind of realm of trauma, physical traumas. So maybe attacks, assaults, sexual abuse, things that happened in our past that threatened our physical selves. And I'm not going to pay much attention. In fact, I'm not going to pay any attention to these because they are more challenging. They do require a therapist. If you've got things that occurred in your past that affected you physically, then that might be something that it would be more sensible to talk through with a therapist rather than just hearing these little ideas on a podcast. It feels like that would be a safer thing to do. But hopefully you've understood kind of the concept of it. There will be something to learn on the whole from physical and egoic things that happened in our past. We can learn from the things that are in the future. So we're weighing up whether it's worth paying the price of shrinking our life in order to heed the anxiety, the fear that we have about the future. When it comes to the past, we're looking at what we can learn about what we did, what happened to us, where we put ourselves, the kind of level of danger that we exposed ourselves to in the past. So I suppose the natural conclusion then is to say, well, where's happiness? If all of this is fear, because I've spent the entire, however long this has been recording, talking about fear, there is actually a kind of peace in this, and that's right at the centre of the graph. That's where the x-axis meets the y-axis, where the horizontal meets the vertical, right in the centre, because in that moment we are in the present, we are in the now, and we are not adhering more to our physical or our egoic selves. We are in balance. Every part of us is being considered and we are able to respond instantly. And that, I suppose, is the aim, really. So if you have some fear, try not to just be afraid of it in the first instance and want rid of it. Try and interrogate it. Try and see if it can illuminate something. And if you're struggling to do that on your own, then find yourself a good therapist because they will almost definitely be able to help you. And hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks very much. See you soon. Bye. Thanks for listening. The next episode, which will be a conversation between myself and a co-host, will drop in a few weeks. In the meantime, if you'd like to have more of our conversations and metaphorical excavations, then, if you haven't already, do follow or subscribe to the podcast. And if you'd like to do me a favour, then I'd love it if you would share a favourite episode with a friend. See you again soon.